Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 2024 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Christophe Courchaine. I'm the Interim Director of the Environmental Law Center here, and also the Director of the Environmental Advocacy Clinic, and the Associate Professor of Law. We're pleased to welcome you to the presentation today. Each one of these talks is your lucky day, worth one Vermont CLE credit. So please keep track of which talks you attend for your own records. We will have some time for Q&A after today's presentation. For those of you who are watching on the VLGS YouTube page, you can enter your questions in the chat space at any time, and we'll get through as many as we can at the end. But today we're pleased to welcome Professor David Wirth. Professor Wirth is a professor of law at Boston College Law School, where he has served as Director of International Programs. He teaches environmental, administrative, public international, and foreign relations law. And previously, before his time at BC, he was Senior Attorney and Co-Director of International Programs for the Natural Resources Defense Council and an Attorney Advisor for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs for the U.S. Department of State. He's the author of more than 6 books, articles, and reports on international environmental law and policy for both legal and popular audiences. He's a graduate of Yale Law School, and he also holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in chemistry from Princeton and Harvard, respectively. Professor Wirth has taught in our summer program for over 30 years, and we're always glad to have him back. This summer, he's teaching the international law of food. Today, he will present on a very pressing, important topic, UN Roadmap for a New Global Plastics Treaty. So please, join me in welcoming Professor Wirth.
All right, thank you very much, Christophe, for that very kind introduction, particularly the last bit. It's always a pleasure to be here in Vermont and to work with you and the students who are so enthusiastic. It's also always a pleasure to speak in the Hot Topic series. And the topic for today is the new UN Plastics Agreement, and that is currently under negotiation. And let me see if I can correctly share my screen here. For some reason, this is not doing. 1 second. Okay. Okay, sorry for that. Can you confirm that you're seeing the PowerPoint? Yes, okay, very good. All right, so the ELC and Christophe have asked me to speak today about the new UN Plastics Convention, a major new international environmental agreement that is currently under negotiation on a very pressing issue of our time. Many of you, including probably everybody in my generation, would recognize this particular photo from The Graduate more than a half century ago. There's a great future in plastics. Think about it. Will you think about it? Well, my job today is to help us think about it from a vantage point of nearly 60 years later, when plastics look very, very different than they did in 1967. Here's what plastics look like today. This is a sculpture outside the offices of the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi that captures the magnitude of the problem. We are simply being overwhelmed by plastics, which are most definitely useful in some situations, but also have disadvantages in others. What I'd like to do is to, first of all, talk about the nature of the regulatory challenges facing us with respect to plastics, particularly the challenges on the international level, where there is no international legislature, there is no international executive, there is no international police force, and there is no international court of general jurisdiction, even though there are some arbitral tribunals that call themselves that. So the challenges on the international level are much greater than on the domestic, where Congress, where national legislatures yield the power to compel performance by private parties, such as producers and users, as well as consumers. So I'd like to start off just by describing the sources of microplastics. Microplastics are defined as 5 microns or less. And then there's also a problem of nanoplastics as well, even smaller. Most of the research has been devoted to microplastics, which are easier to study because they're actually visible to the naked eye in many cases. So plastic waste has doubled in 2 decades. Single-use plastics are likely to end up in the ocean. The costs of plastic pollution to the economy are over $100 billion per year. And not just as we're going to see, not just from disposal, not just from the waste management side. In 2016, about 11% of the world's plastic waste enter our rivers. Plastics break up into tiny particles, microplastics and nanoplastics. In fact, contrary to popular belief, most plastics are not, in fact, recyclable. I'll get to that in just a minute. So that most plastics that have ever been produced are now still extant on the planet, just in a form in which they are broken up into smaller particles and distributed literally around the Earth. The one particular area of concern is in the water column, particularly in the high seas, and where they're distributed and perhaps consumed by wildlife. So a study of microplastics in wild-caught fish revealed evidence of plastics in the intestinal tract of 65% of the 496 species measured. The problem of plastic pollution is inherently international. Even if plastic is disposed of within the boundaries within the territory of a particular state, it is very, very likely to reach beyond that state after broken up into smaller nano and microplastics and to make its way beyond the borders of that state. Moreover, the pace of plastics and chemicals production is growing faster than global capacity for assessment and monitoring. The problem with plastics is inherently one of fossil fuels. The starting materials are typically petroleum, as well as other fossil fuels, such as methane, largely petroleum, however, and controls on fossil fuels are also likely to affect the plastics industry. Conversely, if controls on fossil fuels are likely to make the use of plastics more attractive to industry as alternative uses to fossil fuels instead of burning. The head of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who came to my class once, said that future generations will look at us and marvel that we actually took this marvelous stuff, petroleum, and burnt it, of all things. What a wasteful use, because it has the starting materials for many useful chemicals, including plastics. So this is the Pacific Garbage Patch, where there's an issue of commons management that is facing all of us on the planet. When I say all of us, I mean every individual, but particularly states who are anticipated to be parties to the global instrument on plastics, and I'll describe the shape of that later on. So what are the implications for human health? Together with my colleague, Dr. Philip Landrigan, who is a renowned epidemiologist, we have done a study for the Annals of Global Health, documenting in particular the health concerns associated with plastics. Plastics are the signature material of our age. 98%, as I said, is made from fossil carbon. It is associated with harms to human health at every stage of its life cycle. In fact, the life cycle aspect of plastics production is essential to an effective regulatory intervention at the domestic level and also at the international level. So plastics hazards extend well beyond microplastics and beach litter, well beyond those that find their way into the well beyond those that find their way into the oceans. Plastics are highly complex manufactured chemicals. I was originally trained, as Christoph said, as a quantum chemist. I am now in the process of retraining myself as a polymer chemist. Please don't tell my thesis advisor. But they are potentially unlimited in the combinations and permutations that can be assembled and put together to produce plastics at the end of the pipeline for a variety of purposes. This is also a challenge from a regulatory point of view. How do we identify the substances and the chemicals of concern, the products of concern? Many of the additives are highly toxic. The neurotoxins and endocrine disruptors, in addition to the effects of plastics themselves. So I doubt that this audience needs much in the way of education on the environmental and public health costs of fossil fuel extraction. There are occupational hazards, also community hazards in terms of exposure to toxics and other hazardous substances. Also social effects, which fall largely on marginalized and less advantaged communities that may be poorly represented in political decision making. Oil and gas transport has obvious consequences for the environment and for public health in all countries, particularly in countries of the global south where much production takes place, and the impacts on human beings that are associated with it are likely to be especially pronounced. So there is a pervasive environmental injustice that characterizes the fossil fuel extraction and further on down the pipeline, further on down the life cycle in terms of the production of plastics from petrochemicals. Industrial processing plants are basically chemical production plants and involve hazards that go with them, including explosions, accidents, as well as long-term chronic exposure to substances such as monochloride, which is a starting material, a monomer from which a large number of subsequent plastics are produced. Leaching of chemical additives from plastic into the environment and into human beings. Many of them, these are plasticizers. These are chemicals that are added to plastics that appeared as the colored dots in the previous slide. Many of them are themselves toxic or endocrine disruptors, including PFAS. So Dr. Landrigan headed up an enormous study of which I was privileged to be a co-author, the Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health. It appeared recently in the Annals of Global Health and has substantially affected the ongoing United Nations Environment Program negotiations on a global instrument. In fact, it's leaving my own contribution aside, I think it's fair to say that it is now the leading source and the leading analysis on plastics and their impact on human health. There are many other studies that have been done, including environmental studies. This particular negotiation is the subject of a great deal of attention, as I'll describe in just a few minutes, not necessarily an awful lot of action in response to that. So now it is quite clear that there's very specific health hazards of plastics use. Micro and likely nanoplastics are also found in human placentas, human brain tumors, and in human coronary artery plaque, excuse me. This short documentary, Plastics People, was premiered at the most recent round of negotiations on the UN instrument in Ottawa, Canada, in April of this year. So many people would think that a significant part of the problem could be addressed by plastics recycling, but it turns out that it's actually not very effective. First of all, less than 10% of plastic is recycled by comparison with other streams of recycling, such as paper, such as cans, such as glass bottles. Less than 10% of plastic is actually recycled. Most of it cannot be recycled because it's chemically diverse and it contains multiple toxic additives, as we saw from the previous slide. In fact, I am told by those who are experts on this that basically only the numbers 1 and 2 at the bottom of a plastic container are indeed recyclable, and the rest of them are not. They just end up being broken down and distributed into the environment as either micro or nanoplastics. And again, of the ones that actually can be recycled, very few actually are. So, and that which is counted as recycled, at least in some jurisdictions, is burnt. It's incinerated, which creates air pollution and greenhouse gases, or it's exported. So basically, we need to treat plastics as something that endures in the environment with potential impacts on the ecosystem and, as we've seen, human health indefinitely into the future. Most of the plastics that have been produced in the plastics era since World War II are now still exist in the environment. So here's some findings from our study in the Annals of Global Health about the health hazards specifically from plastics recycling, which of course need to be factored into the entire life cycle of plastic as one of the risks, one of the hazards from it. Microplastics in the ocean break down into microplastics and nanoplastics and contaminate the water column. The plastics, the garbage patch in the center of the Pacific Ocean, of which I had a picture earlier, has attracted a lot of public attention. But the real concern is the plastics that you can't see, microplastics and nanoplastics, which enter the marine food web and including fish that are eaten by human beings. Many of those plastics still have their toxic chemical additives from the previous slide, including PFAS, including BPA, and that can leach out into and enter the cells and act as toxins within the human body, in addition to the effect of the mechanical effects of plastics in situations such as placentas and in brain tumors, as I mentioned earlier. Plastics are inherently part of the life cycle of fossil fuels. So that includes petroleum, which is a principal starting material, provides many of the monomers for that are assembled into plastics, but also coal and natural gas. So we need to look at the production of those feedstocks as those starting materials as part of the life cycle of plastics when we are analyzing their impacts, number one, and number two, looking at options for regulatory interventions on the international or on the domestic level. These appear in many different settings, in incineration, in bio-based plastics, in incineration from recycling, as is pointed out at the top of the slide. So the impacts are diverse and significant on the general problem of climate from the life cycle of the extraction and the use of fossil fuels, including to create plastics and for generation of electricity and heat and in manufacturing as well, of course. So for that reason, the United Nations Environment Assembly mandate calls for an international instrument that applies a life cycle analysis to plastics. This is one of the first instruments, not necessarily the only one, but one of the first in a systematic approach, at least in theory, to apply a life cycle analysis to plastics. In other words, to look at extraction, to look at production, to look at use, and to look at eventual environmental fate. Not just a plastic bottle as it appears sitting on the desk in front of me here in my office, but looking at where it came from, what those impacts are, and where it's likely to end up in the future after its use. So disposal and decay produces methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Obviously, plastics that end up in landfills use up precious space within those landfills. We need to look at the shipping of plastics and how emissions can be reduced there. And also avoid upstream emissions from resource extraction, cracking, and polymerization. So we need to know what are some of the economics of this very, very large industry, a $500 billion industry. And in doing this analysis, it's important to remember that no one disputes that plastics are useful for many purposes in medical applications, for tubing for intravenous delivery of intravenous medicines, for plastic helmets for bicycle riders, any number of other useful and in fact maybe something approaching essential uses in our society. The question is to pick off other uses and to determine what ones may not be as compelling in our day-to-day life. So in terms of uses, building and construction, consumer and institutional products, packaging is a very, very large component, as is and the largest one on this is, in fact, 36% is the largest one on this diagram devoted to packaging. Also, packaging, if you think about it, most packaging is disposed of as opposed to recycled. Now, maybe some is potentially recycled, but consumers, as we saw earlier on, only 10% of plastics overall are recycled, so that much packaging falls in the category of single-use plastics that do not end up being recycled or reused. There's a need for greater understanding of the risks, even as these negotiations are going on. Now, I should emphasize that from our point of view, that is, from the point of view of the Monaco Commission authors, that is not a reason for not going forward with the negotiations at the present moment. There should be a mechanism built into the treaty, as there is in many other international environmental agreements, about collecting more information and folding that information back into subsequent processes to determine future interventions from governments and coordinated behavior by the parties to the treaties in terms of moving forward with next steps in light of new evidence. So the risks from macroplastics in the ocean are fairly well known. Ghost fishing nets that capture and interfere with marine life. The risks from microplastics, as I've already said, are less well characterized. They haven't been, microplastics are harder to find in the water column, and exactly what their life cycle is has yet to be fully characterized by comparison with macroplastics, such as ghost fishing nets that have attracted a great deal of attention. There are costs associated with reducing plastic production and use. It's easy to come up with substitutes for some single-use plastics, such as plastic straws. One can use paper or cardboard. which one tends to see now, particularly in restaurants instead of plastic, not uniformly. But there are costs associated with reducing plastic use, and perhaps some uses ought to be preserved as highly desirable from a societal point of view, particularly in medical uses. So we need better resolution of risks and costs associated with microplastics in the ocean and elsewhere. The agreements to manage microplastics risks should acknowledge the unknowns, but also allow for adaptation as knowledge progresses, as I said. A lot of attention has been focused appropriately on waste management and the end-of-life treatment of plastics. So the removing microplastics from the ocean may not be feasible. It has proven quite difficult to remove even large pieces of plastic from the Pacific garbage patch. The better solution is to apply the precautionary principle and to prevent those plastics from reaching the ocean in the first place. There are a myriad of problems that are poorly recognized by the public, and in particular the problem of tire wear, microplastics breaking off of tires and eventually ending up in waterways. And reducing the footprint of plastics is an important goal. So one needs to be beware of adverse effects of switching to other materials. We've learned this from the stratospheric ozone problem, where switching from fully substituted hydrocarbons such as chlorofluorocarbons to hydrofluorocarbons has also proven to be involve its own risks, so that the substitutes can involve the creation of risk as well. Those ought to be analyzed before they are deployed and encouraged by any multilateral intervention. So where are we? If we look at that sculpture outside UNEP headquarters and the spigot of plastic inundation falling down on the world, the UN initiative, as with most multilateral initiatives, does not write on a blank slate. It builds on previous international initiatives that hopefully add to the political vitality of the multilateral instrument as it is negotiated, and helping it to enter into force and be implemented in an effective manner. So, for instance, there are a number of agreements that already deal with some aspects of the plastic problem. The 1972 London Convention, previously known as the London Dumping Convention, deals with dumping of plastics. A plastics amendment to the 1989 Basel Convention on Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste, specifically to deal with plastic and to regulate plastic waste as it moves across borders. But those are limited. We're dealing only with ocean dumping in the first instance, and the second, we're dealing with identifiable plastic waste that are shipped purposefully across borders, presumably for disposal on the other side. As we've seen, the problem is much bigger than that, particularly the problem of microplastics finding their way into us as human beings, as well as into water bodies. There are also non-binding instruments. The G7, which just recently met, has identified action plans on marine litter. Again, probably the most obvious of this much larger problem. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has a framework of action on marine debris from 2019. APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Forum, roadmap on marine debris, and CARICOM, which is a regional economic integration organization in the Caribbean, has a declaration to address plastic pollution. So these are, first of all, in the first group, they don't deal with all aspects of plastics disposal, far from it. Second, deal with regional issues so that they're less than universal. But they at least provide an existing framework on which a multilateral effort can be built. To put it another way, they provide some political momentum that is already there in the countries, in the states that are associated with these instruments to move forward to the next level, to a universal binding multilateral agreement adopted under UN auspices. The Alliance of Small Island States Leaders Declaration from 2021, also a specific group of like-minded states that are particularly adversely impacted, but that contributes to the political momentum as well. So a lot of times when we talk about multilateral instruments, we forget that domestic policies are necessary to implement them. Domestic policies in particular countries, or in the case of the European Union, a regional economic integration organization, can buoy up and provide a foundation for the elaboration of measures more broadly in a multilateral agreement that applies more widely. So the European Union has a single-use plastics ban directive from 2019, reducing consumption of lightweight plastic carrier bags. In the United States, we don't seem to have we don't have a national policy on plastics, even single-use plastics, but at the state level there and the local level there has been a great deal of action. So the National Conference of State Legislatures has model plastic bag legislation, and there are bans in Boston, my hometown, Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle, and San Francisco. Those tend to create a climate of receptivity to internationally motivated measures. China has a prohibition on single-use plastic straws and bags, and India has a ban on single-use plastics and items ranging from straws to cigarette packets. So the point is that a variety of states already have made interventions in this field that can provide a springboard for further action on the multilateral level. There have been in the private sector, there have been unilateral pledges from companies, from corporations, from private sector actors, corporate leaders that have been identified by climate action, and pressure from investors through ESG initiatives. All of this outside formal governmental channels, and in an environment that does not involve specific regulatory interventions. These are private, voluntary undertakings, but nonetheless helpful in establishing a climate where there's a greater awareness of the risk presented by plastics, number one, and number two, a greater receptivity to risk management actions that would address them. Certification schemes such as PolyCert Europe also contribute to these private voluntary initiatives. So now to the main event. The United Nations Environment Assembly resolution from March 22 sets out a roadmap. It's based on the Paris Agreement, which is a bottom-up approach, the Paris Agreement on Climate adopted in 2015. So that the Paris Agreement is, as I just told my students in the class in the hour before this, is based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and diverse capabilities. In other words, it's designed to cast the net widely, so to speak, and to include all countries, both countries of the global north and the global south, through the principle of differentiation. How exactly, and the identification of basically voluntary domestic plans, how that plays out in the plastics setting has yet to be seen. Some have criticized it in the Paris setting as perhaps contrary to the notion of universally binding global requirements. We're talking about a new autonomous institutional arrangement that would be probably built on best thinking, at least in theory, and reflect the state of the art in international environmental governance through the Paris Agreement, through the Minamata Convention on Mercury, and others. So you can see that the academic writing here, including myself, that has contributed to this thought about how best to organize these freestanding treaty undertakings in a way that creates momentum and also folds in the opportunity for future action. The scope of the mandate is not entirely clear. The UNEA resolution, which is the instruction to the working group, which consists of all states on the planet, the instruction from the United Nations system and the outlines and the scope is not entirely clear, even in its title. The goal is the long-term elimination of plastic pollution in marine and other environments. What exactly is plastic pollution? Is plastic pollution just the waste end, the ultimate fate end? Does it include production? Does it include use? Not entirely clear what that word pollution means, but the resolution does elaborate on the expectations of the United Nations system with respect to the output. First of all, a full life cycle analysis. I tried to describe that earlier on, a cradle to grave approach that includes the impacts of plastics at all phases of their life cycle, including from extraction, from cradle, so to speak, production, use, and ultimately disposal, from the beginning of their life cycle to the end. To address all aspects of sustainable production and consumption on plastic, including the adoption of circular economy approaches. So, for instance, the EU ROS directive on electronics specifically deals with both production, but also disposal at the end of electronics lifespan. This is important because many electronics contain heavy metals that can be recovered, as well as they are a waste stream of particular concern from the disposal point of view. So the life cycle analysis should promote sustainable trade in plastics and products containing plastics, which means that we need to know exactly how the plastics came to be and what their likely impacts are before they enter trade. We need specific coverage of microplastics, which have been demonstrated to be a subject of particular concern, as I said earlier on, particularly from the health point of view. Differentiation is a cross-cutting theme in international environmental law and policy at the moment. Flexibility, taking into account national circumstances, differentiated capabilities, all keywords that indicate responsiveness to particular countries and particular circumstances in the plastics life cycle. There should be roles for, this is what the UN is saying, not me, roles for all stakeholders, including the private sector. I have had the good fortune to attend as an observer 2 rounds of the 4 that have taken place so far. I plan to attend the next one in November in Busan in Korea. It is very, very helpful to have stakeholders from a variety of sectors, in my case, academia, also from the non-governmental sector, from environmental advocacy groups, from industry, to observe and to see for themselves what is in fact going on the floor of the negotiation. Here's some issues that we wish had been included. When I say we, I mean the commission, the Monaco Commission on Plastics and Health, intergenerational equity. We are altering the oceans and the environment, not to mention ourselves, most likely irreversibly. The impact on future generations has not been determined. Again, common but differentiated responsibilities. How exactly does that play out? To what extent do countries of the global south get to what extent is there a differentiated system in terms of responsibilities? Precaution is not mentioned there. Precaution has been accepted in international environmental law and policy. for something approaching a half century, and then trade. Very, very important that the life cycle aspect is important to trade in plastics, and has been a subject of some dispute within the World Trade Organization suite of obligations with respect to international trade. Basically, the WTO system is very skeptical of national measures, national at the border measures that are based on the way a product is produced as opposed to its content. Okay, we recommend that we extend coverage beyond microplastics to include many of the thousands of chemicals that are incorporated into plastics as part of the product. Looking at uses, which ones may be unnecessary, which ones may be avoidable, incorporate extended producer responsibility so that plastic producers can be held accountable for the safety and the ultimate management of their products, and also mandate reductions in the chemical complexity of products. Many of these, there's a premium in this product stream for innovation, understood. But if that innovation is not necessary to the function of the product, it's easier and more manageable from a regulatory point of view to have a grip on the universe of monomers and polymers that are actually part of the product stream. The UNEA mandate, the United Nations Environment Assembly mandate, does include a recognition of the need for a just transition. That includes both within civil society, such as waste pickers in developing countries that might earn their livelihood from managing waste, including plastics, as well as countries at different stages of development. We also need the creation of a permanent science advisory body, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The area of plastics is so complex and requires so much particularized expertise that the process for providing that information should be regularized. It should involve consultation among the world's greatest experts, including Dr. Landrigan, my co-author, and the lead author on the Monaco report. There are models out there, and those models should be incorporated into plastics. Okay, just to wrap up and bring us up to date. The UNEA resolution calls for completion by the end of this year. There have already been 4 rounds of negotiation. It is possible to complete this negotiation in Busan. The progress has been halting at best. As noted here, there is what in the business is known as a very highly bracketed text. Brackets, as my former students know, and as my current and future students will soon learn, brackets in the text indicate words, portions that have not yet been agreed. By one count, over 1,000 brackets and positions that have not yet been agreed. It's broad agreement to include coverage on waste management, but beyond that, not an awful lot. The High Ambition Coalition is being led by Norway and Rwanda with an expansive vision of what the agreement might include, but it's not clear that other states are prepared to go along. We still have unresolved the critical question of the choice of instrument. Is this going to be an executive agreement like the Paris Agreement, which has to, this would be internationally the equivalent of an executive order, relying strictly on existing executive authority, such as the Toxic Substances Control Act. That could limit what the United States could agree to. Or is it going to be a formal treaty that is submitted to the Senate for its advice and consent by a 2/3 majority? Those are not getting through now. So the decision to proceed as a formal treaty is likely to mean that the United States will take a very long time to become a party, if at all. The life cycle analysis is not clear how that's going to feed in, even after the 4th round of negotiations. just transition specifically identified in the UNEA mandate. One of the fundamental issues concerns the substances of concern. Monomer starting materials, polymers. Is there going to be a list of chemicals and substances of concern, even fossil fuels themselves? That's problematic because if it's a closed list, then that suggests that innovation in to produce polymers that are not on the list would be acceptable, but they might pose very much the same risks. So the alternative would be to come up with a descriptive standard. That has difficulties because how is that translated into actual operational terms in terms of the regulated substances and the regulated products? None of these have been resolved yet. One of the problems in the negotiation has been that there have not been intersessional, informal intersessional discussions that have been mandated. That's where much of the progress occurs. As any negotiator in a formal process will tell you, sitting on the formal floor of the negotiation, speaking into the microphone, having your words translated into 5 languages may be fun and may be exciting, but it's not the place where the real compromises get made and the substance of an agreement gets hashed out. Again, something that my former students have already learned in their simulations that I do every year here at Vermont Law School in the summer, and my current and future students will learn in the near future. Okay, so just to close, I wanted to give you another picture from the front line, so to speak. This is a picture of a van that was driving around the negotiations recently in Ottawa. I did not vote for the UN to dictate if I can use plastic. Say no to the UN. So there is sentiment that, as you can see depicted here, that tends to push in the direction of less rather than more momentum. Hopefully we will be able to overcome that in the future and agree a meaningful convention by the end of the year on the deadline. There are some risks associated with agreeing prematurely to an instrument that is not strong enough. So one of the issues on the table at the moment is whether to extend that deadline. In any event, many thanks to Christoph and Vermont Law and Graduate School for the opportunity to speak here today, and I am looking forward to questions.
Thank you, David, for a wonderful presentation and fascinating topic. Always generates a lot of buzz and interest and is on people's minds these days for sure. One question that occurred, we'll start, I should say, if you have questions for Professor Wirth, please enter them into the YouTube chat space. And we'll make sure to get through as many as we can in the remaining time. We have one question that is really about sort of the average person dealing with plastics in their lives. They're so ubiquitous. They're so integral to virtually every product we buy. What types of disclosure requirements for the specific plastic constituents that you talked about posing such significant health risks? What types of disclosure requirements are being discussed in the international context, and maybe certainly we don't see much on the domestic side in terms of consistency there?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question, which is a good one. I don't know that disclosure requirements are being discussed at all on the international level. I mean, basically, the concern is more about plastic pollution. As I say, there are a variety of views as to what pollution means. Does it just mean disposal at the end of the life cycle? That part's relatively well agreed. And most states have some means of controlling that. But in terms of disclosure, in terms of information, which is, as we all know here at Vermont Law and Graduate School, is a very useful tool for encouraging individuals to think about their own choices, such as California's Prop 65. I don't know that there are specific proposals that are addressing that. One of the issues, but the question does show highlight one of the main issues in the negotiation, which is to what extent are there going to be globally applicable rules? Remember, the theme of this agreement, at least as it's set out in the UNEA resolution, is differentiation and national plans. What does that mean? Does that mean that states get to determine their own rules domestically? To what extent are there any harmonized requirements across all the parties to the agreements? That's still very much up in the air. So this suggestion, which I would tend to support as an excellent one, is disclosure in terms of packaging. So for instance, if I purchase something that's not clear what the packaging is or how to dispose of it or what its content is, remember, most plastics are deployed in packaging. That would be very helpful. But the structure of the negotiation doesn't lend itself particularly well to these kind of broad across the board rules.
So, pardon me, bad time to have a frog in my throat. But the one question that has occurred is the justice part, the sort of environmental justice component of this discussion. You alluded to it a few times as something that is either a gap or something that people are working through. Can you talk a little bit more about how EJ is playing out the kind of negotiation?
Right. Well, this agreement, I think for the first time, or at least one of the most recent agreements to include a requirement in the mandate for, and the exact language is a just transition. So that's, as the question suggests, it alludes to environmental justice and getting us from wherever we are now to someplace in the future where plastics, I mean, the executive director of the United Nations Environment Programming, or Anderson, has said the goal is to eliminate plastic pollution. So when we get there, the question about a just transition looks at the process of getting there and also a landing place that includes that recognizes EJ concerns among regulatory concerns as well. This, I have to say, this was new to me. I went to the Ottawa round of negotiations, and there was a representative of the waste picker community in Kenya who spoke to a small meeting. I was extraordinarily impressed. This is somebody who actually lives in a landfill and whose livelihood and his family's livelihood comes from the earnings associated with disposal of waste. So that provision is obviously directly addressed to this individual and his circumstances, which apparently is far from unique and widespread, particularly in countries such as Kenya of the global south. So it could also apply not to members of civil society solely, but also to states broadly understood. Okay, so that many international environmental agreements have some sort of transitional provisions in them. So for instance, Article 5 of the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer identifies a group of states that are low users, low consumers of chlorofluorocarbons, and hence get a 10-year grace period. So it could also apply to states. Not clear exactly what the content is because the negotiations are just at such a poorly developed phase right now. But those are two aspects of, are we talking about environmental justice to members of civil society, individuals? Are we talking about it to environmental justice to states that are in situations of different capabilities on target code?
We do have a question for the audience that's maybe thinking ahead based on this topic. And given the hazards associated with plastics, could they ever be reduced to safe levels, given those health risks, or will we be in this state forever where plastics are both extremely useful for various things, but also extremely hazardous part of our environment?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a hypothetical question, as that picture suggests. We're in something of an emergency situation at the moment. So the top priority is to pick off the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, in the form of single-use plastics, packaging. Those can be and those that are leaching out into the environment in an uncontrolled situation. If we could do that, that would at least be major progress. The second question that the negotiators are grappling with is whether to reach up the pipeline to deal with production as well. So to put caps or quotas on production of plastic. So on the theory that if you don't produce it, it's not going to end up in the environment. That's another way to deal with the turning off the spigot. That's an analogy that's been used many, many times in the negotiation. We need to turn off that spigot. Now, if there are some streams that are highly useful to the point of being necessary, the life cycle analysis ought to be able to identify those for us, and also to identify interventions that result in appropriate treatment of those streams from the cradle to the grave. Right now, it's such an undifferentiated and chaotic situation that it's difficult to get a hold on the main problem. One could imagine a situation where we have the happy result of discussions about whether particular uses continue to be essential. That, for instance, came up in the ozone negotiations as well. Chlorofluorocarbons are very useful as propellants because they don't interact with biological systems. Basically, they're non-toxic because, this is the chemist in me, they are fully substituted with either fluorine or chlorine. They don't interact with biological systems. So they can be used as propellants, for instance, for asthmatic inhalers. And those, so particular streams such as that were identified as necessary and kept even after the ban went in place. So there are precedents for that kind of approach in international environmental law, particularly in the Montreal Protocol, which has been probably the single most successful international environmental instrument that has been adopted since in the modern era.
Well, David, I think we've reached the end of our hour with you. Thank you so much for what was a fascinating presentation, and thank you even more so for your active and vigorous participation in these incredibly challenging international negotiations over the years. It's a truly remarkable set of accomplishments and challenges that you faced in your career. And we're grateful that you were able to share the current iteration of what you're dealing with our viewers today. So I think we'll wrap up here, and I want to thank our viewers for joining us today. Our next talk will be taking place online on Thursday with Professor Anthony Moffa from the University of Maine. Same time, same place. See you then. Have a great day, everyone.